Hello, comrades. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for another session of Why Marx. Tonight, we're continuing to look at the early CPGB and specifically the role it played in the 1926 general strike in Britain. I've already distributed a couple of articles by Jack Conrad. Next year is, of course, the 100th anniversary of the general strike, so there's going to be loads of meetings celebrating it, etc. So it's, I think, important to take a critical look back at it, and I think Jack's going to criticize not just the TUC and the Labour left, but also the role of the CPGB. Over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Tina. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to begin my talk with a little bit of historic context. And I suppose we could begin with the April 1925 general election. This is the general election. I think it was the Times and the Daily Mail just before the election took place published the Zinoviev letter, purportedly from the president of the Communist International, urging the Communist Party of Great Britain to arm, infiltrate the army, prepare for revolution. We all know that it was a forgery. We knew at the time it was a forgery. It's been definitively proved. You know, did it come from White Russians? I don't know. But yeah, the Secret Service, the bourgeoisie, the Tories published this in the same way, in the same sort of spirit as the exposure of mass anti-Semitism in the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, did they believe it? No. Was it cynical? Yes. Either way, what this resulted in is, I think it was an actual increase in the Labour vote. You'd previously had a minority Labour government. This was a government that was urged upon the establishment by the King. But what you saw in the general election is basically the collapse of the Liberal vote. This is a process of going towards a two-party system, not the Libs and the Conservatives, but Labour and the Conservatives. Liberal vote collapses, and given the nature of the first past the post system, you had an oppressive 200 Tory majority. Now, the point I really would make about this is that given that you knew at the time that this Zinoviev letter was a fake, was a forgery, what we're dealing with here, therefore, is an illegitimate Tory government. And I'd also add a couple of other things to sort of background the general strike. And that is that the Labour government introduced, how should I put it, a number of reforms, not many. But what you didn't have is universal suffrage. So you still had women, not all women, middle-class women had the vote, but working class women didn't have the vote. And also, I think it's worthwhile mentioning what was happening over the water in Ireland. There'd been a civil war in Ireland, and I think that needs to be fed in to what I'm talking about. Either way, it's also worth adding in the defeat of the miners, the isolation of the miners on Black Friday, but also the victory of the miners on Red Friday. And this is when the government introduced or agreed to introduce a 9-month subsidy that would stop wage reductions and an increase in hours of miners. This was the result of solidarity from other unions. And what the other unions had done, what the TUC had done, had been to agree that if there were wage cuts, if there was an increase in hours, remember the miners were a crucial section of the working class in Britain, 1 million of them, that if these cuts, if this increase in hours was introduced, then there would be a general strike. So everybody in Britain knew that that was a threat. And what was noticeable about this situation, this 9-month interregnum, is that the TUC basically sat on its bottom. And the fact of the matter is that in terms of organizing this general strike, the first time that it got round to doing that was 48 hours before it was due to start. In contrast, the Tory government was vigorous in its preparations. So you had Churchill and other right-wing ministers, for example, organizing the OMS, the Organisation of Maintenance and Supplies. This was a strike-breaking operation. You know, if you look at certain films, certain novels, this is all, you know, the sort of Cambridge students driving trains and all the rest of it. Well, it wasn't so much train drivers, that's more difficult a job, but bus drivers, lorry drivers, 100,000 mainly middle class volunteers. You also had, contacts between the government and the British Union of Fascists. And you also had, in the run-up to the general strike, the sort of visible presence of the armed forces, not least the Navy. So the Navy was deployed in ports, visibly threatening, port towns. It's also worth adding that the Communist Party of Great Britain, which by then had a weekly paper called the Workers' Weekly, not the Weekly Worker, ran in terms of its masthead every week, X weeks to go before the general strike. And in terms, if I've got criticism, and I've got more than one of the CPGB in the run-up to this general strike, because we all thought, well, I say we all thought, everyone thought it was coming. The government showed no sign of capitulation, and it was the government that was basically saying, we are not going to blink, and trying to force the TUC into blinking. That if you look at the writers in the Weekly Worker, the leading members of the Communist Party, we'll leave aside the Labour left, let alone the Labour right for the moment. They couldn't make up their mind what was involved in this general strike. Does a general strike pose the question of power? I would argue that it does pose the question of power. Or can you actually have a general strike that is simply in solidarity with the miners and would get you the concessions from the government simply by the exercise of industrial muscle? And indeed, you had, as week went by, one after the other, you not only had different authors making one of those arguments, you even had the same author on different weeks making the opposite argument. So although the Communist Party is to be praised in the general strike, it was going to mobilize, it was going to stand with the miners. It did stand with the miners. It did act in a principled fashion. There seems to be, as I say, a muddle at the heart of it. Now, did that reflect factional divisions, or did it simply reflect collective confusion? my impression, and I have read Workers' Weekly, for the period that we're talking about, week by week. So all I would argue is the fact that you didn't have factions meant that this muddle remained. It wasn't resolved. Either way, the TUC went ahead with the organisation of the general strike, and it was determined that this was going to be a respectable general strike. It deliberately mobilized the strike in 2 waves. The least militant workers were told to go first. The TUC issued instructions for workers to stay at home, don't go to the picket line, tend the garden, organize football matches with the police. They indeed did happen. That's not just a myth. But meanwhile, in terms of the government, what you saw was militant policing on their side. What you saw is strike breaking in terms of the OMS volunteers. So the government was determined to, as I said, force the TUC to blink. The TUC was determined to run a respectable, a non-threatening general strike, if there can ever be such a thing. And I think to illustrate where things were at, it's worthwhile looking at the TUC Congress. And at the Congress, yes, it voted totally. We're going to stand with the miners. There was never any doubt about that. But when it came, for example, to the motion moved by supporters of the Communist Party, I think it was Harry Pollitt that moved the motion. Either way, they moved a motion saying that the TUC should prepare workers' defence corps, that you should defend your pickets from the police by organising defence squads. That was voted down. When it came to the TUC taking on more powers, we'll come to the notorious "all power to the TUC" slogan in a little. That was referred. They weren't going to agree. They weren't going to agree to that. So how should you put it? The conservatism of the TUC was on display. So although they sang the International, although they sang the red flag, there was a lot of display going on. I should also add that in terms of the determination of the government, there was a police raid on 16 King Street. Now, what was 16 King Street? This was the headquarters of the Communist Party of Great Britain. It was located, I think, genuinely in King Street. By the time I joined the Young Communist League in the 60s, they still called it 16 King Street, but it was actually located in Bedford Street. But anyway, the point would be this is their headquarters in Covent Garden. They not only raided King Street and took away all manner of odds and sods, they also arrested a dozen leaders of the CPGB, proceeded to put them on trial, and lo and behold, judge and jury found them guilty. Apparently it wasn't a crime to be a communist. It wasn't a crime to believe in communism, but it was a crime, according to the prosecution, to be a member of this Communist Party. And what you saw is half of them getting a year-long sentence. The other lot got a 6-month sentence. Now, again, in terms of my criticisms of the CPGB, what I find remarkable is that given how long they had to prepare for this general strike, is that when it actually began and the printers went on strike, that closed down the Workers' Weekly. Now, we're not talking about an extended strike. Nonetheless, their paper didn't come out. And what we were reduced to, I don't know if anyone knows what a duplicator is nowadays. Every revolutionary, when I was a kid, had to have a duplicator. It's how you produce leaflets. That's what the Communist Party was reduced to. And of course, anyone caught with a communist leaflet, this was something you could be arrested for, something that you could be sent away for. But it is remarkable because if you take the Communist Party, when it was a lot more respectable, a lot more right-wing, i.e. before World War II, I don't know if anyone's ever read Douglas Hyde. He was someone on the Daily Worker staff, but he was given responsibility for setting up illegal printing shops. And I do find it remarkable that given that there was talk in Workers' Weekly of this being a revolutionary moment, that the CPGB didn't make provision not only to have an underground leadership, but also to have an underground series of printing shops, as they did in the in the situation of where the Daily Worker was banned, by the government in the conditions of World War II. Okay, how big was the CPGB? I think the figures were something like 5,000, and it's worth noting, and I think this is, testimony to the militancy and the spirit of self-sacrifice of the CPGB membership. I think out of the 10,000 arrests during the course of the general strike, 1,000 of them were members of the CPGB. Okay. Yes. Let's move it on. Okay. Let's come to some of the problems, or some of the more problems of the CPGB. You had this slogan, all power to the TUC. Now, I personally would have no problem in conditions of a general strike to say that the TUC ought to have more power. Fair enough. But all power? This really is looking at the TUC, which is a, how should I put it, glacial body that, is elected once a year by slow-moving, bureaucratized trade unions, as if we were dealing with something equivalent to the Russian Revolution with Soviets. Now, what you had in the general strike, just as you had back in 1920, is the formation of these things called councils of action. These organizations, existed alongside trades councils. They were similar to trades councils. But the point about these organizations is that they, had much more in common with Soviets than the TUC General Council. Why? Because you had delegates going to these bodies and they were recallable. Now, okay, we're dealing with a concertinaed period of history. We're not dealing with something equivalent of February 1917 to October, November 1917. Nonetheless, if you were going to come out with a slogan of that sort, then it should have been looking to these councils of action, not the TUC. And indeed, again, looking at Workers' Weekly, you had again this sort of lack of decision, lack of clarity when it came to the trade union and Labour left. And so again, what you've got is perhaps a situation where at least some leaders of the CPGB took the left statements of trade union left leaders on face value, took the left statements of those on the Labour left at face value, and sort of projected a strategy of pushing these people further to the left, as opposed to exposing them, going round them, and replacing them as the leaders of the working class. Okay, we all know how the strike went. What is remarkable is when the TUC did blink, and famously the TUC was basically presented with an ultimatum: look, either you take power or you surrender. They had no appetite for power. They surrendered. The miners carried on. They were on strike. Eventually, they were defeated. If you look at what the TUC leaders were saying, if you look at what the left leaders were saying, we haven't been defeated. It reminds me very much of the official line of the NUM in 1985. Defeat? What defeat? We haven't been defeated. Of course they were defeated in 85. Of course they were defeated in 26. You saw the strike called off. What is remarkable, and again showing you something of the militancy of the rank and file, is there were more people actually out on strike the day after it had been called off than the day it was called off itself. It's also worthwhile pointing out the number of non-trade unionists who are actually out on strike. But yeah, the working class was defeated. The miners did take a pay cut. Their hours were increased, but also this wasn't just a defeat for one important section of the working class, i.e. The Mine Workers Federation. It was a strategic defeat for the working class itself. And what the employers did with the encouragement of the Conservative government is to weed out from factories, from mines, from mills, from workplaces, weed out the militants. And what you saw is sackings of the most prominent militants. And obviously that profoundly affected the Communist Party. Now, I'm not going to go into the so-called class against class, 1929 and all the rest of it. But if you look at the size of the CPGB, it recruited in 26, it recruited lots and lots of miners, for example. But in the course of the 1920s, its social characteristic changed. And it became an organization of housewives and the unemployed, as opposed to being an organization very much that was rooted in industry. Now, of course, we had the the economic crash in 29, but no, it wasn't that. It was the defeat of 26 that changed the social composition of the CPGB. Okay, what time have we got? So we're going all right. Okay, so having talked about the muddle, and I think there was muddle there in terms of the CPGB in the run-up to the general strike. What I'd also raise is, how should I put it, the economism of the CPGB during the general strike. Now, if you look at the CPGB, it didn't have a program. It had the program of Comintern. If you look at its national minority movement, which is its industrial wing, it had 1 million affiliates to it. And if you look at its program, it wasn't all bad. In fact, there was a lot that was very positive with it. So it didn't do what many left groups today, limit itself to hours and conditions and tuck on a few political questions. It was political. Nonetheless, if you look at its propaganda up to and during the general strike, there was the idea clearly that this was an economic struggle. And as long as workers went on strike, the government could be forced to back down, as it had with Red Friday, and the working class could march forward by electing left and ever more left leaders. There was no attempt, from what I can see, in terms of reading, articles and pamphlets of the time, to link the struggle in Britain, for example, with the struggle in Ireland, or for that matter, the struggle in the British Empire. Remember, Britain, might have been the declining hegemon, but it still ruled over the world's biggest empire, not least India, a country, of course, that was yearning to, throw off British rule. There was no attempt to raise the women's question. There you are, working class women were deprived of the vote. There was no attempt to question the legitimacy of the Tory government, the fact that it had been elected on the basis of a forgery. There's an Zinoviev letter, an attempt to scare the electorate, a successful attempt to scare the electorate. There's no attempt to raise Republican and Democratic demands. So the role of the king, the role of the House of Lords, the role of the church and the armed forces. None of that, featured. So it was running an economic struggle. Now, it's also worthwhile discussing the role of Moscow here. And what I mean by Moscow is Comintern. I think that there's too much myth, in terms of the British left when it comes to the 1926 general strike. And that is the idea that it was Moscow, it was the Stalin, Kamenev, Zinoviev leadership. It was the Stalin, Bukharin leadership that was responsible for the conservatism. Now, I'm using the word in relative terms. If you wanted the economism, if you want the centrism of the CPGB, I just don't buy that one. My reading is that the CPGB was a fantastic achievement of the working class movement when it was formed in 1920. It was more than the sum of its parts. Nonetheless, that did not make it, other than in name, it did not make it a Bolshevik party. It did not make it a fully rounded Communist Party. It still suffered from many of the illusions, many of the problems that characterized the British Socialist Party, the Communist Unity Group, the Socialist Labour Party, and other such organizations that went in to the formation of the CPGB. So I just don't buy the idea that the amateurism, the economism of the CPGB was made in Moscow. I think it was made in Britain. And if you look at what Comintern was saying and the leaders of Comintern, and I would include Trotsky here, they were criticizing the rightism of the CPGB in the run-up to the general strike. They were not holding the CPGB back. And that applies also, and this is factional politics with this British Russian trade union committee. This is something that Trotsky protested about. Why, when the TUC sold out the general strike, why didn't the Russian TUC break with the British TUC? Well, the British TUC did break that particular committee. This is in conditions where the Labour government had recognized, diplomatically, the Bolshevik government, the Soviet government in Moscow. This was in conditions, remember, of post-Civil War, of reconstruction, of blockade. Russia was economically desperate, and anything that they could do, to break Russia's economic isolation is something that they valued. But the idea that if the Soviet trade unions had broken with the British TUC in the aftermath of the general strike, that this would have made any difference to politics in Britain, I think is utterly delusional. Indeed, if you look at the Russian writers, they were critical. All of them were critical of the CPGB. Now, that didn't mean that the CPGB was rubbish, and if only, you'd had some little sect instead of it, everything would be fine. No, I think that would be a very foolish argument. But I think it is a mistake to blame Moscow, Comintern, the Russian Communist Party, for the problems of the CPGB. I'd also add in that respect, some writers on the left, and I'm particularly here thinking of a pretty, interesting pamphlet written by a couple of, well, they would have been in the International Socialists. This is James Hilton and Richard Hyman, and their little book on the CPGB and the general strike. They too, if I can remember it correctly, say that no, it wasn't Moscow that was to blame. But what they come out and say, and I presume this is sort of a justification for their factional situation, I would guess in the 70s, they basically say, look, it was delusional to believe that you could have a mass Communist Party in conditions of Britain. No, you couldn't. You could only have a cadre party. Now, I actually reject that. Now, it doesn't mean we can roll history back and say, if only X happened or if only Y happened, everything would have been fine. But I don't see anything in Britain that makes it impossible to build a mass Communist Party. It's true that the Communist Party in the 1920s was tiny. On the other hand, in terms of its influence, it was considerable. And I would certainly make the argument that its influence could have been, how should I put it, extended into a sizable and indeed a mass membership. Now, as I said before, I'm not going to go into the third period and those sort of politics. Suffice to say that had a staggeringly negative impact on the CPGB and its chances of becoming a mass party. So I'm actually going to finish there. Leaving plenty of time for discussion.
Thank you, Jack. Tina's had a few technical difficulties with her computer, so I'll step into the breach for the time being. I was fascinated to read your accounts. You circulated some articles beforehand. One of the things that I found so interesting, really, was how the 1926 general strike followed on logically as a consequence of things that had happened in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. In particular, the whole business around strikes to, for example, hands off Russia and that kind of thing. But the other aspect to it that I found interesting was the extent to which possibly, on the one hand, Lenin was obviously enormously appreciative of what was going on in Britain at the time. But the other aspect of it was the extent to which maybe he was over-optimistic about just how bad the British trade union movement and Labour Party was. While we're waiting for other comrades to pitch in, I wonder whether you could give that, expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Well, I mean, if you want to look at the background of the general strike, I mean, one could obviously look back, but I would certainly begin with the relative decline of British imperialism and the fact that it faced German competition, American competition, and it needed to, how should I put it, put the working class in Britain in its place. That's my reading of the background. So the capitalist class was propelled by an economic logic to discipline the working class. So yeah, you had a huge upsurge in class struggles following World War I. We saw the TUC threatening a general strike if Britain kept arming the Poles in 1920. Yes, if you read Lenin at the time, he was brimming with optimism. I do think that revolutionaries should, given the chance, brim with optimism. We attempt to make history. We are agents in history. And I'd also add, and I think that this is important, that we need to understand the objective strength of the working class in Britain. I mean, subjectively, in terms of politics, Britain, yes, was backward. It was dominated by Labourism. That is certainly true. On the other hand, in terms of the working class, it was the biggest working class in the world. It mattered, in other words. And so if the British working class was moving, your job is to do everything you can to encourage it. So I'm sort of reminded of the formation of the Labour Party, 1900, its affiliation with the support of Kautsky, but also the support of Lenin to affiliate to the Socialist International. They didn't know quite what to make of the Labour Party. Is it a trade union? They allowed trade unions to affiliate. On the other hand, it's both a trade union and a political party, but not quite a political party because there's no individual membership to this strange thing. Kautsky described it as a step towards a party. Lenin was much more cautious about that. Either way, in spite of everyone knowing that the leaders of the Labour Party, not least those in the Independent Labour Party, people like Keir Hardie, Ramsay MacDonald, were right wing, it was important to encourage this step forward, this huge step forward for the working class movement in Britain, because that was a huge step forward for the world's working class. So yes, of course, Lenin proved to be wrong. But as I said, our job really isn't, and it's pretty futile to sort of, how should I put it, reel back history and imagine that it was bound to turn out like that, that human beings do make a difference. Of course, the objective circumstances do limit us, but that doesn't mean that everything that happened had to happen. If Silver Pankhurst and Harry Pollitt hadn't been doing, the picketing in the London docks, would the Jolly George incident have happened? I'd argue no. If that hadn't have happened, would the TUC, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, we can always look back at revolutionaries and say that they were over optimistic. Imagine a situation if Lenin had magnificent foresight and said, well, in 100 and something years, things would look like they look like now. God, what would you do? You'd get your gun out and you'd shoot your brains out, wouldn't you? So I think that we all have to be. I think we've got an obligation to be optimists. Why? Because we want to change things.
Thank you. Comrades, anyone who wishes to ask a question, make a contribution, please click the raise hand function. For the moment, I can see Tina.
So a couple of questions to Jack, and thank you for the intro. I was listening on my phone. The zigzagging is an interesting one, I think, of the CPGB, that it didn't quite know how it should engage with the Labour left and the TUC, or it did know, but it changed its mind a few times. And you did touch on this, especially in your articles, and I thought was a really interesting idea. Is the question that had the CPGB been allowed to have factions, that could have worked out quite differently. It could have led to the policy being clearer and being clarified and having a particular line that's was properly debated in the CPGB and publications, etc., with to and fro, and having different trends properly organized. But of course, the reality was that that in the as part of being part of Comintern and being a very uncritical part of Comintern, what happened is that when the Russian Communist Party banned factions as an emergency measure in 1921, as a military emergency measure because of the civil war in Russia, etc., that was taken as a doctrine, wasn't it? It was turned into a doctrine that had to be implemented, not just in Russia, but had to be implemented worldwide into all the communist parties that wanted to be affiliated to Comintern. A huge mistake. I think one of the huge mistakes under Lenin, that were committed under Lenin. You can explain why it happened in Russia, but exporting that kind of lack of democracy into countries where there weren't a civil war, made very little sense in exporting this, but also really, really hampered the Communist Party, CPGB then, and it's still hampering the left today. So that if you have got anything more to say on that aspect, would be interesting. How factions often seen and are seen still today when you look at Socialist Workers' Party, Socialist Party. None of these allow factions. None of the Trotskyist groups allow factions because they say it will lead to the opposite. It will make disunity. It creates war and fighting in the organization. You've actually argued that it possibly does the opposite. It clarifies and it brings people together on a you understand what your differences are and you can perhaps then come together. So something on that would be more interesting. Also then, and that's a bit broader, is the role of a strike, the role of a general strike. I mean, there are differences obviously, but I get the impression the 1926 strike wasn't a real general strike. It was called a general strike, but it was more I mean, there was confusion, but it wasn't a general strike in the sense that it really challenged for power, and in that sense that nobody was ready for it. Nobody was prepared to actually challenge for power. And you touched on that in your opening. Can a general strike, what can it achieve? Is it the same as a normal strike in the sense that you can achieve certain concessions? And if not, why not? Because I would have thought, I mean, if a general strike, obviously, if we take the real meaning of it, it means everybody stops, everything stops, and then you'll have to start thinking about the working class organizing everything, don't you? If you don't go to work, how are you going to distribute food? How are you going to get people from A to B? If the buses stop, etc. It sort of immediately opens up the question of us running society, the working class running society. Now, it certainly wasn't a general strike like that, but, can't a strike in general, a general strike in the sense of a number of unions getting out there, enforce, or force through some concessions. I know what your criticism is of the general strike, that if you call it a general strike, then you should be prepared to go all the way, and you should be prepared to challenge for power. Do you think it was just a misnaming of the strike that's still going on to today? I suspect. I mean, you still have a lot of groups calling for a general strike over this issue or that issue, but are they really prepared to challenge for power? Are they really prepared to organize production, organize distribution, etc.? Is that just a question of naming it the wrong thing, or are we talking about entirely different ideas of what a general strike, if it's a real one, would be like and would achieve? Yeah, that's it.
Shall I come back
Yeah.
on that, Ian?
Please do.
Okay, useful questions and contribution there, Tina. Look, it was a general strike. This should be clear. It was a general strike. Was it? It wasn't just a protest. So when the Socialist Party says 24-hour general strike or whatever, you go on strike one day, you go back to work the next. I'm not against it, but that clearly isn't posing the question of power. But yeah, if you have millions of workers on strike, if the buses stop, if the rails stop, the TUC made special provision, quite correctly, for power, for hospital workers or whatever. That's right. But they didn't challenge management's right to manage. I mean, me looking back at my history books, I've got sort of seared in my brain, lorries moved, and many lorries moved with a note on the front of the driver's cabin with the permission of the TUC. That's the correct approach. You don't want old people, going hungry. You don't want them dying. We want to keep kids alive. We want to keep the society going. That is all correct. The question is, it poses the question of power. So no, the TUC certainly didn't call the general strike on the basis of this was a revolutionary act, that through it you would take power. You cannot take power just through a general strike. If you're going to take power, you have to have arms. You have to be able to split the army. But a general strike can be part of coming to power, but it poses the question of power. So precisely the government turned around and said to the TUC in negotiation, who rules? The Constitution, us, the King, or you? And the TUC buckled. But yeah, the question of power was posed. It was posed by the Tory government. It was posed by the situation itself. This is an unconstitutional act. This is about a power, who rules. Okay, the TUC obviously wasn't up to it. That's obvious. And all I would argue on the question that you posed about factions, this is really me sort of scratching my head, because yeah, I've looked through Workers' Weekly, week after week after week. I've read, the various leaders of the CPGB and what they were saying. And my impression is, as I said, lack of clarity. And so that I'm making the argument that maybe that lack of clarity could have been overcome if they'd had the right to organize factions. Now, that isn't a guarantee, because you can get two factions that both are wrong. Nonetheless, in a situation of where you have argument, of where you actually have a clarification, I think that's a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness. And you're right, that when you look at the SWP, SPEW, one carries on down the list, that the general tendency on the left is to say faction rights, this weakens you. My argument would be no. Of course, factions aren't to be positively welcomed. It's not good in and of themselves, but better to have a factional struggle than it is to get it wrong. And I think the CPGB got it wrong in 1926. Now, I wouldn't argue that if only the CPGB had did this or that different, there you are in 1926 in July or something like that, you would have had a CPGB government. That simply, wouldn't have happened, couldn't have happened. There's no point even considering that possibility. But I would make the argument that with greater clarity when it came to politics, that what you potentially could have won is something that Trotsky talked about, in conditions such as, for example, France in the mid-1930s, a more generous democracy. You could have won concessions from the ruling class with working class strength. And that doesn't mean that those concessions are permanent, doesn't mean that they wouldn't be contested. But the sort of dreadful defeat that did happen in May, I would simply argue, wasn't inevitable. There could have been a different result. What else? Yeah, I think that's my answer on that one.
Thank you, Jack. William, over to you. Welcome back. You need to unmute yourself, Conrad.
I'm muted. Well, I have to say this week's lecture is considerably superior to what we had to suffer last week. And I'm very pleased that Ireland gets a mention, because the other two speakers last week never mentioned it at all. Now, I do think there are comparisons between what happened in Ireland in 1913 and the general strike in 1926 in Britain. What you had in Britain was you had a general strike that was organised by the TUC, but in Ireland you had a general lockout that was organised by the employers. Now, the positive things that came out of the two of them was that the rank and file organised themselves in such a way to survive. Soup, kitchens, and that sort of thing, and trying to organise themselves on a day-to-day basis, which was an alternative to the free enterprise capitalist system in both countries. People tend to ignore that. Like in Ireland, the soup kitchens that were founded in 1913 in Liberty Hall, children, when the lockout was over, actually were starving to a greater extent than they were during the actual lockout, because the organisation of food was organised, and that happened also in a lot of places in England during the lockout or the general strike in 26. I noticed that you mentioned a fellow called Andy Pollock. Andy Pollock was the General Secretary of the CPGB. And as far as we're concerned, he destroyed communism in Ireland. He told a blatant lie. In those days, communications were difficult. Not like they are now. They weren't electronic and they weren't texting or anything like that. And a letter came from the Comintern in Moscow, and it was misinterpreted deliberately by Andy Pollock. And he asked for the Communist Party of Ireland, which was only after been established in 1920, at the same time as the British Communist Party was been established. And he said he was ready to disband. It took about 60 years or more for that lie to be found out, because after the Berlin Wall fell, and there was the papers of the Comintern were available to historians. An Irish historian called Emmett O'Connor, who was also a Russian speaker, teaches history here in Derry. It's not actually a university, but it ought to be called a university. It's a major college in Derry that he teaches in. And he went to Moscow and studied the papers, and he came across the original letter that was sent to Andy Pollock for to be passed on to the Irish Communists. And the Irish Communists who set up the Communist Party of Ireland would have been Liam O'Flaherty, the author, and his brother Thomas O'Flaherty, and Rory Connolly, who was the only son of James Connolly. The three of them set up the Irish Communist Party. The Irish Communist Party was destroyed by Andy Pollock, who is, as far as we're concerned, was nothing more than a British jingoist and had no respect for Ireland in any shape or form. Now, the fact that the speaker tonight, Jack, mentioned that Ireland was the first blow against the British Empire, and it had places like India and other colonies. It gave them, it mightn't have been as successful in Ireland in 1916 Rising, but it did give other people encouragement to go out and fight the British Empire, and they did fight the British Empire, and it was a stimulation for them in order to be able to do that. Now, it is a page of glory, the general strike, insofar as the rank and file, and I've read about different places where it was uneven, but in some places the workers got together, and there was no alternative economy in particular areas, and that happened also in the recent miners' strike. Well, the miners' strike that Scargill in the 1980s. Those mining villages were able to organise, and women, and they were never active in the community, played a leading role in those. I mean, I remember collecting tons of lots of money and goods for them in Dublin. We used to send them over. Actually, Scargill's wife came over and spoke at one of our rallies, and we supported the British miners in that strike. Now, that's the sort of thing that should be looked at. I don't think you have the same radical tradition that we have, and we have a radical tradition as opposed to a revolutionary tradition. The French have a revolutionary tradition. They produce Madame Guillotine. That's a nice, clean way of dealing with the enemy. But no, the Irish have a radical tradition. They have a go at them, but they won't go in for the actual kill. The British won't even go in for the kill. All they want is reformism. So that's the story. Well, anyway, thank you very much for today, for giving Ireland a bit of recognition. It's a great help. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Ant, over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hiya. Hope you're all well. Just a few things. I read the materials that were circulated, and I thought that overall they were pretty good. I think that the main. I think the main sort of like level of agreement was that this was no glorious episode. This was a defeat that had profound consequences for a long time, and to me, I think it looks like. Well, let me see what was actually. I'm quoting from I think the article, "A Study in Bureaucratic Inertia." where I'm quoting, "It was a stage-managed bureaucratic affair," and that sounds about right to me. You know, it has all the odor of a trap around it. But I think that the point that I see as being important for today is the attitude towards the so-called labor movement. I think in the same article, A Study in Bureaucratic Inertia, I'll quote again, a declaration seconded by Pollitt, so I take it that's a CPGB, yeah? Correct me if I'm wrong. The union movement must organise, prepare the trade unions in conjunction with the Labour Party and the workers to struggle for the overthrow of capitalism. Well, to me, it's absolutely rubbish. And I think that to this day, there seems to be this illusion that you can sort of like use the Labour Party. You can still create some sort of a united front, or you can somehow take over the Labour Party, or there's something that you can do apart from reject the Labour Party. And I'm going to say that the real authentic communist position is these people are false friends and need to be given rejection. I think in another one of the articles, I think this one's on is it something like weakness and virtue of the CPGB? I'm not quite sure. So sorry, but I'm going to quote from the article anyway. And it's talking about all power to the General Council. Yeah, and I think Jack says unless it is led by communists, authentic communists, there is not the slightest chance of representing the interests of the working class taken as a whole. But to me, all of this is creating, the idea that the trade unions could be led by authentic communists, and they are something other than what they are, which are integral aspects of capitalism. Parts of the capitalist mechanism. They cannot be won to revolution. The unions are fully integrated into the state in the leading capitalist countries, and they are not independent class organizations. Regardless of the millions of workers who are members, unions are not training grounds for socialism or transmission belts for revolutionary politics. And I think that the Third International got all this wrong. And I think that the subsequent Stalinist Trotskyist myth that the unions can be transformed by having the right leaders is completely disproved by the entire history of how they evolved. The unions have a role, and that is to negotiate with the capitalists, not to overthrow them. I'm gonna also say I'm going to put it to you. I'm going to put it to you that the authentic communist position is we have nothing to say to the trade union bureaucrats or the Labour Party. We can become members of trade unions to get close to the working class, but not take up positions or hope that the leading roles in trade unions are going to be occupied by revolutionaries. And I'd like to say, just to end, just a little point at the end. Some organisations to this day, still call for a TUC general strike. But I will say that a general strike is not what we need. It's not the same as a mass strike. A mass strike arises from the working class. It is not ordered from above. So I'm going to say, I think that the articles made some very good points as regards the traps of this whole episode, and the way the positive answer to it is not the general strike, but the mass strike, which has a chance of becoming revolutionary. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Lovely.
Thank you, Anne. It'll only be in a matter of time before you subscribe to Weekly Worker.
I'll read it all the time.
Ken, over to you.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Jack. My question's a relatively brief one. After the, if you like, collapse of the general strike, how far did elements outside of London pursue a communist agenda, or if you like, a revolutionary agenda, and how far did the bulk of the post-general strike communist effort filtered down solely to London, and how far did that regional development, if there was any separate regional development, affect the future of communism in Britain? Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, Tina, you come back. Hello.
Yes, I managed to find another computer quickly. I mean, you did, Jack mentioned the national left-wing movement. No, I think you mentioned the national minority movement actually as the way for the Communist Party to get involved in the unions. And there was also the national left-wing movement for the CPGB to get involved in the Labour Party. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about those two campaigns, which ones were successful, how were they successful, and how can they sort of help us with our tasks today? What is worthwhile copying and what we shouldn't copy? Thank you.
We've got some other participants, but do you want to take those points first, Jack?
I think it would be a good idea, Ian, otherwise I'll just get lost. Okay, I'm glad William liked my opening today. I would also add, William, if you looked at my articles, I was also sort of struck by, how should you put it, the failure to learn from the tactics of Ireland. And what I'm thinking about isn't so much 1913, I'm thinking more about 1916 and barricades. I'm somewhat surprised that given the role of strikebreakers moving goods around the country, that they didn't establish checkpoints. They didn't establish barricades, not in the French way, but in the Irish way. Either way, what you had in Ireland is not only, huge struggles, but you had, I'm not well enough read on this, but given that Ireland had just had a civil war, not to raise Ireland as one of your central questions in 1926, I think is unforgivable, and I have read the material. As to your Andy Pollock, I don't know Andy Pollock. You'll have to tell me who Andy Pollock was. The CPGB General Secretary, unless I'm wrong, was Albert Inckpin, and he was General Secretary until Harry Pollitt became a General Secretary. So I just don't know that history. So I'll have to read up. So if you could send me any information there, I would be grateful. In terms of what Ant was saying, I think the perspective that you're putting forward is pretty hopeless. I mean, okay, so you don't want to talk to trade union bureaucrats. Okay, fine. I'm not particularly keen on talking to trade union bureaucrats either. I don't believe that if I sat down with a trade union bureaucrat for 100 years, sort of a metaphor, I would persuade them to shift. A trade union bureaucrat is a trade union bureaucrat because of their social position. And what we're dealing with here in terms of the role of the trade unions as trade unions is the bourgeois politics of the working class. So they're dealing with selling the commodity labor power, they're integral to the system of wage slavery. And although they bargain on behalf of their members, they do nothing to overcome the wage slavery of their members. I think we all know that. I think we all agree with that. The question then comes, okay, what are you going to do about trade unions? Karl Marx, I don't think, was of the view that you should have nothing to do with the British trade union movement. The Socialist International had and thought it was highly important to have trade unions, not least the British trade unions affiliated to them. That didn't mean that if you just left them to their own devices, they would produce a socialist revolution. No, but the idea that communists shouldn't struggle to lead such institutions, to me, is basically, well, let's boycott politics. Let's go off to the politics of purity, or let's establish red trade unions. I think this is a profound mistake. In the same way, I would advocate standing in elections. That doesn't mean I've got any illusions in Parliament, except you can use it. You can use it as a tribune. Why you can't use trade unions for revolutionary purposes is beyond me. Why can't you? You can use Soviets. That doesn't mean that Soviets are automatically revolutionary. If we look at 1917, we know who established the Soviets in February. It was the Mensheviks. It was the socialist revolutionaries. We know who dominated them for the initial period, but we also know the history of the Bolsheviks winning elections, and not only in the Soviets, but in the trade unions and in local representative institutions as well. So I think myself that as long as you're operating what I would call democratic centralism, of where your trade union officials are under the command of a communist party, as long as your MPs are under the command of a communist party, it doesn't mean that everything's smooth, but I do think that that is the way to go. Standing aside, I think, is politics of isolation, politics of sectarianism. And just on this question, there's Harry Pollitt. I think he was at the TUC. He gets up and says the TUC should do this, the Labour Party should do the other. I think that what you're missing here is the possibility of this perhaps being what you'd call the politics of exposure. That what you do is demand off the fake leaders of the working class X, Y, and Z. When they don't do it, you say, look, they didn't do it. And in that sense, I'm reminded of the arguments in Russia, publish the secret treaties. That was something that the Bolsheviks raised in terms of the ministers, socialist ministers in the Kerensky government. Did they think that they were going to publish these secret treaties? It's unlikely, but what did it do in terms of rank and file soldiers? What did it do to working class citizens of Russia? It exposed the provisional government that talked the language of socialism, talked the language of peace and a just peace, and at the same time was committed to the imperialist alliance with Russia and France in the same way as Tsarism was. In other words, the provisional government was a continuation of Tsarism. Throw that aside, up to you. To me, it's a valuable tactic to use, but no, you don't. When you move such motions, it doesn't indicate that you think that, I don't know, Ernest Bevin or whoever, Novak today is going to carry out a revolution or anything remotely like it. But yeah, the politics of exposure, I think, is a legitimate one. Your argument about a mass strike versus a general strike, I just think is silly. A general strike is a mass strike. From a top, from below, that depends who's at the top, doesn't it? So I'm again looking at Russia. It was the Military Revolutionary Committee that issued the instructions from above to carry out an insurrection. Oh no, we can't have that. It's all got to be spontaneous from below. This is just nonsense. So this is playing at revolution. Revolutions involve both actions from below, but also actions that are directed from above. And indeed, we want a situation of where revolution is organized precisely for the reasons that Tina touched upon. And we don't want chaos. We actually want public order. We want our own police. We want an ability to manage society. We don't want the breakdown of society. We want a new order in society. So it's quite right to have, lorries moving, taking goods, but under whose control, under whose direction, with whose permission? And it shouldn't be just up to anybody on X, Y, or Z picket line. Centralization, a decision of what's going to happen and what's not going to happen. That's important. The working class shouldn't reject leadership. That's childish. That's anarchism, in my opinion. Okay, Tina, you asked about the national minority movement and the left-wing movement. The left-wing movement was the left of the Labour Party. Worth noting that the TUC that voted these lefty motions in 25, the same leaders went on into the Labour Party and voted to bar communists. That should tell you something about the sort of nature of the trade union bureaucracy at the time. The communists were being purged by the Labour right. That's what was going on. What you could have done, I don't know, but closing down the national left-wing movement, in my view, was a mistake, not least with the disaffiliation of the Independent Labour Party in 1931, but that's beyond my history. And then we get into, more science fiction, what if history. Then the national minority movement, it did have the danger, and there was a real truth to it, that the national minority movement, because it involved the leaders such as A.J. Cook of the miners and Purcell and other left-talking trade union bureaucrats, it bred illusions in these people. And the job of communists is to actually tear away illusions about these people. But it's an art. Certainly if you don't engage with such people, then you're never going to expose them. That would be my argument anyway. Okay. Ken, you asked about unevenness. The CPGB was an incredibly uneven organization. I haven't got the facts and figures at hand, but if I said South Wales, if I said Scotland, these would be the heartlands of the CPGB. London, the East End of London, the Jewish East End of London, and that would also be true. But this is a small organization. But yes, in specific localities, it exercised real influence, but it still was an incredibly weak organization. And my argument is that the general strike was a strategic defeat and the Communist Party suffered. And in that sense, I think that the experience of defeat added to their not just material dependency on the Soviet Union, and in the late 20s, we're talking about Stalin, but also intellectual subordination to Moscow as well. And, you know, the CPGB was noted or notable for its lack of independent thought. You know, maybe there was someone here and someone there, you know, the Balam group comes to mind, you know, a few comrades who became Trotskyists. But no, what you had is, because, I'm not going to say because of defeat, but defeat added to the sort of slavish mentality when it came to advice from Moscow. And they went from a situation where they accepted good advice in general in the early 20s to where they are accepting appalling advice in the late 20s and I think, you know, treacherous advice by the 1930s. So I'm thinking about the Popular Front, of where the Communist parties basically go full Menshevik, you know, class collaboration with the progressive sections of the bourgeoisie and all the rest of it. But again, this isn't my subject, but I'm making the argument that 26 was a body blow against the CPGB, both in terms of its industrial strength, but also in terms of its potential to start thinking. And Tina's made the argument, I mean, we don't know, but once you ban factions, then I think you're lost. And as I say, my argument was that in general, the advice from Comintern in the early 20s on balance was good. In the late 20s, it was bad. But you had no ability to organize against what was bad. And therefore, you ended up with the liquidation that we saw, what was it, 1991, you know, sort of winked out of existence with the Euro communists.
Thank you, Jack. Pamela, over to you.
Right. Okay. So my first comment is what John was saying about the concept of Communist Party, of pushing the existing leaders of the TUC to the left rather than organizing rank and file to actually replace them, which I think is relevant to today. So my question is, you know, how and why is this study relevant to today, which is really important. And in connection with that, I'd really like to know how comrades of the party now, you know, are working. Are they working in their trade unions? What do we do? So I went to the NEU conference as a delegate this year, and there were sort of two main issues. One was that they passed a motion supporting for a potential ballot to strike, having had an indicative ballot, which got just below 50%, which they needed. And secondly, to support the teaching assistants and people like librarians who are NEU members, but because of shenanigans at the TUC, the NEU is not allowed to recruit them. So they were the two main things that were passed, I would say. But I was only involved from my branch in the Palestine motion. Now, the Palestine main motion, whoever it came from, was quite good in the sense that it demanded an embargo on arms and condemned Gaza, et cetera, and had all the demands in. But nothing was said about the repression of the Palestinian movement, the journalists, the demonstrators, the head of the director of Palestine Solidarity Campaign, Ben Jamal, and Chris Nynam from Stop the War have both been charged under the Public Order Act. Alongside that, there's serious repression of the direct action people, Palestine Action, Just Stop Oil, with really severe prison sentences. in addition to that, there's this issue that the judges will no longer allow defendants to use the argument of justifying their direct actions on the basis of the of genocide, for example, in Gaza. Anyway, so so there were 7 amendments to this resolution. Mine wasn't taken. My resolution was from my branch, which first of all asking the NEU to be more involved in the divestment campaign, because they are ignoring the members of the union who have their pensions with local councils and whose pensions are a large extent complicit with Israel. But the main thrust of my motion was to confront the state repression and include the discussion of the IHRA, which is being used to threaten any local councils who try to divest from Israel. That wasn't taken. So the question today, and I'm part of a rank and file organization challenging the bureaucracy. So that's my question. It's all this is extremely relevant to today, and the struggle against the bureaucracy and the trade unions. There's been a few left-wing leaderships like the Bakers Union and the FBU under Matt Rack, and 1 or 2 others. But it's a real struggle in the trade unions, and I'd like to hear from comrades about their struggles and what they're doing. Thanks.
Thank you. And Tina, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, just really as a sort of final question to Jack, and perhaps you could use it as a way to sum up the discussion, because I don't think there's anybody else now. Is the question of what role does the general strike really play in our arsenal of communists? Is it something we only raise in a revolutionary situation? Is it something we don't raise in a revolutionary situation? Because in a revolutionary situation, we actually have to go further, and we have to, overthrow the constitution, etc. Make plans to take over the state on every level. Are the two related? Is it a tool that we should be careful about how to use it, or can it work to mobilize people even in a non-revolutionary situation as it is today, and will probably remain for some time? Just sort of your view on how we use those kind of tools would be interesting. Thanks.
Thank you. And just for my own interest as well, you'd mentioned about the distinction between objective and subjective factors. It seems to me that subjectively we are on the bones of our arse in terms of numbers of people who are members of communist parties, that kind of thing. Objectively, the proletariat has never been bigger. The potential for worldwide revolution is greater now than it was in 1920, greater than in 1917, and to an extraordinary extent. But at the same time, we've got things that will hinder us. Very few of us have any military experience whatsoever, unlike in 1920 when lots of people had military experience, both inside armed forces or as or with armed experience, for example, in the Irish struggle. We also have very little experience in the context of Britain and also the United States of organising underground. From that point of view, how do we begin to prepare ourselves for what we would expect to be an important movement? William, do you have a brief point, and Jack can then sum up? You need to unmute yourself, comrade.
Yeah, I agree entirely with that last point you made. It's strange, but the leaders of the Irish Citizen Army, which was the main instigated behind the 1916 Rising were all ex-British Army people. Like the one who organised the British the Citizen Army, Connolly, had been in the British Army. There's no record of him ever being in it, but we all know that he was. He was in under a false name. And he actually joined it when he was about 16, when he was 15, when he claimed he was 16, because you had to be 16 to join it at the time. He deserted the British Army when he met his wife, and he managed to get away with it. In those days, people didn't have birth certificates or anything like that. So he was one of the founders of the Citizen Army. The man who trained the Citizen Army was a sergeant called anyway, he trained Michael Mallon. He trained the Citizen Army. He had been a sergeant in the British Army and had served in India. And the main strategist was actually a captain. George Wright, that was his name. He was from Antrim. He was a DSO, Jack White. And I got the name wrong about Andy Pollock. It should have been Harry Pollock that I was talking about earlier on. And thank you for the correction there, Jack. Now, Jack White was a captain and a DSO, meaning a distinguished officer in the field. You get the DSO medal. It's something like a little bit less than the Victoria Cross, but still it's a big thing to be able to say you got, because you can only get it in the heat of battle. He got wounded by the bows during the Second Boer War, and he had to convalesce for 6 months in a British Army hospital for officers, not for privates, for officers in Cairo. And that's when he came around to progressive politics. He realised he almost died for something he didn't want. He shouldn't have died for. And he ended up, he actually ended up in the Spanish Civil War fighting for the anarchists. But he did train the Irish Citizen Army. Now, the problem with having a full knowledge of him is after he died, his family got all his papers and burned him in a big bonfire. So it was so we don't really know exactly what he done or what he didn't do. But he was quite a character, Captain Jack White. He was, now, but when you were saying earlier on that they didn't form, the British left, or the British working class didn't form resistance in order to protect the pickets. And in the 1913 lockout, the Citizen Army was established in order to protect the workers against the oppression of the police, especially the DSP, the Dublin Metropolitan Police. So there is lessons to be learned on both sides. So thank you for Harry Pollock was the man who destroyed communism in Ireland, as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks, William. Jack, if you'd like to sum up, please.
Yeah, apologies for, I'm not going to deal with Palestine. I'm not going to deal with my trade union activity. I would simply say that, that when we look at today's situation, the left has got a terrible, terrible record when it comes to, how should I put it, promoting illusions in trade union officialdom. Now, I believe in the politics of exposure. I believe in the tactic of a united front from above or below. But a trade union bureaucrat, as I argued before, is in a sociological position of where they have an objective interest in the continuation of capitalism. And that's why when it comes to communist trade union officials or communist MPs or communist councillors, you need them to be under discipline of the collective. So, for example, the Bolshevik members of the Tsar's Duma were under the discipline of the Bolshevik leadership. And so, Pam, I'm you know, am I wrong? You have to tell me, you know, maybe in chat or something like that. Hasn't the NEU just appointed Matt Rack as some official? I'm just amazed.
No, it's the NASUW.
Oh, NAS. Okay. Either
Yeah.
way, this is just a, you know, this shows you, you know, I'm a professional trade union official, as opposed to I'm a communist doing a job for my party, for my class. You know, being a trade unionist, being an MP from our point of view, should be you're in the enemy camp. You're under the discipline of a communist party. If you're just operating as an individual, you might be a left-wing careerist or a right-wing careerist, but you're still a careerist. Just lastly, in terms of what Pam raised, you talked about judges and juries. I think it's just worthwhile noting, and this is about democracy, that in 1925-26, juries would have been all male, and they would have been of the respectable classes. And the fact of the matter is, although a lot of people are being found guilty at the moment, a lot of people are being found innocent, much to the fury of judges, much to the fury of Labour and Tory politicians. But I don't know if you've served on a jury, Pam. I suspect you have. When I have, what is noticeable is the number of unemployed people, for example, on a jury. Now, I'm not saying they're automatically progressive, but there's something democratic in that. So yeah, women being on juries, ordinary people being on juries, that is something that we should defend and fight for. So I'm not surprised that in 25-26, the leadership of the Communist Party was found guilty by jurors. So anyway, that was just a particular thing. In terms of what Tina asked, general strike is a tactic. It shouldn't be a strategy. You don't get to power through a general strike. On the other hand, if you discard a general strike, either as a protest or something more serious that goes hand in hand, for example, with an armed uprising, then I think you disarm yourself in terms of revolutionary tactics. So I'm reminded again, this is sort of my history, I'm reminded of the SWP, in 1984, who argued against the slogan of a general strike, i.e. not a TUC called general strike necessarily, but other unions joining the miners in order to defend the miners, but also to overthrow the Thatcher government. That would be perfectly legitimate. And again, just in terms of my memories of the SWP when they were the IS, arguing against the threat by the TUC in 1972, when they had 5 dockers, when we had 5 dockers in jail, to call a protest general strike. Why on earth would you reject that? We were told, for example, by the SWP in 84, 85, that if you called for a general strike, you'll have to call for Workers' Defence Corps. Well, that's something we did. William reminds me in that sense of the Irish Citizens' Army. Why couldn't you have had a citizens' army in South Wales or in Scotland? And indeed you did on a mini scale. I think in our paper, The Leninist Before the Weekly Worker, I think we reprinted the story of Methil Fife and its Workers' Defence Corps. The pickets there were attacked by the police. And again, various comrades have mentioned military training. The response of the working class in this mining town was to organize a march by a 200 strong Workers' Defence Corps in military formation, headed, this is the story, headed by a comrade in the Social Democratic Federation. That's the story I've got. Now, I didn't know the Social Democratic Federation was still going. Maybe it was, maybe he was the only member in the country. Either way, he led that Workers' Defence Corps on a white horse. And as a result of that, there were no longer any police attacks. So, yeah, if you're strong, the lesson is that the police lay off you. If you're weak, you make yourself vulnerable to the police. So, yeah, why on earth wasn't the working class movement in Britain learning from Ireland? We're not talking about a country that's 1,000 miles away. Precisely what we've got is an interlocking people. Many people in Britain are from Irish roots. Many people in the working class movement in Britain are Irish. Why on earth couldn't we have borrowed and adapted and applied some of those lessons? To me, they were there ready to take up. They were taken up, but in a small way. Anyway, yeah, I finished with that. It's been a very interesting discussion, and thank you very much for your questions and contributions, comrades. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, comrades, and I agree, absolutely excellent discussion. Next week is International Workers' Day, and with that in mind, we'll be discussing the communist unity with the possibility of forging a Communist Party here in Britain. So join us on International Workers' Day next Thursday at the usual time, and thank you and good night, comrades.